The tablet we have a wall charger, which unlike most tablets uses a proprietary magnetic connection, somewhat reminiscent of Apple's MagSafe. The charger actually has a USB port on it, so if you wanted to, you could use it to charge your phone or any other device. It takes a standard 2-pin power input, although the cable provided in my box was actually a US-style power cable, so I'm guessing this tablet was imported from the US. I'll get into the tablet itself in a moment, but for now let's just move it aside and take a look at the remaining two items included. The first is a stylus. It supports 1024 levels of pressure sensitivity, and there's a button on the side which doubles as a means of attaching it to the tablet. Finally is your warranty and basic setup instructions, not that anybody ever bothers to read those, especially that first one. Now let's get this box out of the way and take a look at the tablet. On the front of the tablet we have a 1.2 megapixel camera and an ambient light sensor right beside it. On the bottom is a capacitive home key. On the right side is the micro SD card slot, the magnetic charging connector which doubles as a holder for the stylus, and a mini DisplayPort connection at the bottom. The 3.5mm headphone jack, volume rocker, and sole USB 3.0 port are all on the left side, while on the back you'll find the rear-facing camera and a microphone beside it. Finally, the only thing on the top of the tablet is the lock key. Well, let's turn it on and I'll share my thoughts. I'm sure just about everybody has either used or watched videos of Windows 8 at this point, so I'll avoid yabbering on about the OS too much and only deal with things unique to this particular tablet. Let's begin with a few words about the screen. The first thing about the tablet that really struck me was the touchscreen input latency, or rather the almost complete lack thereof. Finger tracking is a huge subconscious factor in terms of how you perceive the performance of a device, and the Surface Pro's touchscreen is undoubtedly the most responsive and accurate one I've used, with that title previously having gone to the iPad 4. It's particularly noticeable in the web browser, which makes for a very nice browsing experience, and the tablet also supports a stylus, which we'll take a look at soon. In terms of brightness, sharpness, color reproduction, and uniformity, the display performs very well generally speaking. It's rated for a maximum brightness of 400 nits, and while that's not exactly retina meltingly bright, it's actually quite a bit brighter than either of my 27-inch LED backlit panels, so definitely no complaints there. By default, the brightness was adjusted automatically based on ambient light level, but that quickly became annoying, so I ended up turning it off. If you're unsure of how to do that, just open up the Charms menu, choose Settings, change PC settings, and you'll find the option under the General section. Anyway, the display has a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with a pixel density of 208 ppi, so everything is really sharp and you can watch 1080p videos natively on it. My camera doesn't do it justice, but watching a Blu-ray rip of 5 cm per second on the Pro is a sight to behold. Although one minor downside to cramming so many pixels into a display measuring only 10 inches across is that Windows needs to scale the UI up in order to keep things readable, and there are some applications which don't play nicely with that. Of course, being an obsessed nerd who loves having lots of screen space, I always run Windows at the standard 100% scale. As for color reproduction, this of course varies from unit to unit, but mine was very well calibrated out of the box with very neutral colors. The great thing about this display is that even if yours doesn't come well calibrated, you can actually go and calibrate it properly yourself, which is not possible on iOS or Android based tablets. In terms of backlight uniformity and bleed, my unit was just about perfect, aside from one very faint spot of bleed on the lower right edge, but again, this varies from unit to unit. Another thing which surprised me as I used the Surface Pro was how well Windows 8 Pro works with the tablet form factor. Originally, one of my biggest complaints with Windows 8 was Microsoft's attempt to force a new touch-oriented UI down everybody's throat, even if their PC lacked a touchscreen. That's still a big complaint I have with the desktop implementation of Windows 8 now, but on a tablet PC, putting a touch-friendly UI on top by default works very well. If I'm out somewhere and just want to check my email or access my music library for example, Metro gives me fast access to that in a similar fashion to Android and iOS tablets, whereas if I'm somewhere where I need access to a laptop, I can easily switch to the standard Windows UI for heavier tasks. Speaking of heavier tasks, in terms of performance, the Surface Pro is currently one of the most powerful tablets on the market. With a 1.7 GHz dual-core i5, Intel HD 4000 integrated graphics, 4GB of DDR3 RAM, and a 128GB SSD, the Surface Pro's hardware is currently identical to that of Apple's 11.6-inch MacBook Air, with the exception of the display. Try as I might, I've yet to succeed in getting Metro UI to slow down or stutter at all, but I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. Next, let's take a look at one of this tablet's decidedly weaker points, that being the speakers. Now, I consider myself somewhat of an audiophile and can't for the life of me understand why anybody would want to blast their music library through the tiny speakers of a tablet, pissing off everybody within a 5-kilometer radius. Perhaps they get some kind of sadistic pleasure out of subjecting everyone around them to Justin Bieber, I don't know, but regardless, the speakers in this tablet really aren't great. The main problem I have with them is that they just don't have much volume at all, nor do they really have any low-end reproduction to speak of. By comparison, the speaker in my iPad 4 is excellent. Now, as I said, the quality of a tablet speakers isn't really something that I care a great deal about, as I don't have to listen to them very much, but I know some people do, so I thought I'd mention it. Other factors which may be an issue for some people are weight and battery life. The Surface Pro is about 30% heavier than the iPad 4. While it's not the lightest thing I've ever used, the extra weight really hasn't been a problem for me, but some people are finding it a little uncomfortably heavy, so you might want to try this tablet out for a while somewhere before committing to purchase. From a full charge, you'll generally get about 5 hours of constant use out of the battery. It's certainly not the all-day battery life which many Android and iOS tablets promise, but bear in mind that the Surface Pro is essentially an Ultrabook that looks like a tablet. There are 2 magnetic keyboard docks available for the Pro, and the one I have here is the Type cover with physical keys, but there is another thinner version called the Touch cover which uses touch keys. I found the trackpad of the Type cover to be quite usable with buttons for left and right clicking, but overall, meh, not great. The area of the trackpad is quite small and the response a little on the slow side, which overall made for a less than pleasant experience and was a little like trying to push your cursor through mud. The keyboard, on the other hand, is wonderful. The keys have just the right amount of travel, are very tactile and are the perfect size, so if you're happy to use a separate mouse, you'll get along with it very well. For over €100, I would have expected the trackpad to be much better. The quality of the keyboard almost makes up for it, but it's really a question of whether you want to spend over €100 for an attachable keyboard. I personally would not, but it came free with my Surface Pro. Now let's take a look at the performance of the Surface Pro and try out the stylus. For the performance tests, I'm going to be connecting the Pro to an external monitor using an Apple Mini DisplayPort to DVI adapter, but let me point out that while the Pro has no complaints working with the Apple Display adapter, it will not output directly to any Apple monitor over Mini DisplayPort, probably a driver issue. I'll run benchmarks in Geekbench and Cinebench, then we'll move on to a few graphics tests, and finally take a look at the stylus. First, let's run Geekbench. And the score I get is 5,325, which is about half that of my quad-core i7 laptop. Next, I'll run the OpenGL and CPU tests in Cinebench. As you can see, the Pro scored a 15 frames per second average for OpenGL and a CPU score of 2.34 for multi-threaded operations. Before moving on to the gaming test, let's run the Fishtank web browser test using the Metro version of Internet Explorer and see what it can handle. 1 fishy. 10 fishies. 50 fishies. 100 fishies. 250 fishies. 500 fishies. 1,000 fishies. And only when we reach 1,000 fishies does it drop to 53 frames per second. That's really quite impressive, I think. Well, until they all die from the shock of being crammed into such a small area with no room to move. Now let's test a few games. So first off, we have Unreal Tournament 2004 running at 1080p at maximum settings. Despite being almost 10 years old, Unreal 2004 still looks recent and runs extremely well, with frame rates rarely dropping below 40 frames per second, even in areas of intense action. Here's Counter-Strike Source, again running at 1080p and high settings. It actually performs better than Unreal, with the frame rate rarely dropping below 60 frames per second under any conditions, which makes it a perfect game for this tablet. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is a game which really didn't want to run well on the Pro. Here it's running at 1366 by 768 at low settings, and we're generally getting speeds above 60 frames per second, but it has an awful tendency